Look, we all know that real estate has created more millionaires than pretty much any other business. The problem is, it's also created a lot of heartaches and bankruptcies. Sure, we can get access to a ton of real estate education on the internet, but that's precisely the problem. How can we tell which strategies will consistently produce asymmetric returns and which should be avoided at all costs? My goal is to give real estate entrepreneurs, capital raisers, and investors all of the secrets so that we can grow our portfolios without dealing with costly investment nightmares. And that's what this program is all about. I'm Hunter Thompson, and welcome to the Cash Flow Connections Real Estate Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cash Flow Connections Real Estate Podcast. I'm Tyler Lyons, and I'm very excited to have a conversation with you about the economics of the World Economic Forum. And who better to have that conversation with today than longtime friend of the show and the rebel capitalist himself, George Gammon. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tyler. I appreciate it.
All right, George. So let's start at the 30,000 foot level for people who maybe don't know who the World Economic Forum is and who runs that organization. Maybe we can start there. Can you explain in your own words what is the World Economic Forum and who leads that organization?
Sure. Well, I think you got to start with Machiavelli about 500 years ago and his book, The Prince. This has been very influential on a lot of politicians, and I think it is hugely influential on Klaus Schwab and the people at the World Economic Forum, pretty much the global elite, if you want to call them that, the Davos types, the European Union, the IMF. And then another person that was extremely influential on these people would be Thomas Malthus in the 1800s. And so your audience may have heard the term Malthusian. And most of these people, I don't want to put them all in the same bucket, but we'll just say most of the global elite and the Davos types are Malthusians. So they believe that if the population is increasing exponentially and we live in a world of finite resources, that something's got to give. You either need to proactively decrease the population and or you need to decrease the energy use for the individuals in the rich countries who are consuming the higher amounts of energy. And so this has kind of been their mantra since day one. And Klaus Schwab was in, I believe it was Harvard in 1968. And he took a class from Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger was extremely influenced by Machiavelli in the book, The Prince, so much so that they actually put him on a cover of a recent, edition of The Prince, which is still obviously in print today. So Klaus has said many times that this really impacted his thinking to a great degree and really took his worldview to where it is today. So in 1971, Klaus starts the World Economic Forum. Now, back then, it wasn't called the World Economic Forum. It was like European Business Partners or something like that. And I'm not quite sure when they actually officially changed the name, but it was the beginning of what we know today as the World Economic Forum in Davos. And what's interesting, in 1972, his keynote speaker was a gentleman that started the Club of Rome. Now, the Club of Rome back in, this was maybe 1967, 1968, was an organization that was basically not just Malthusian, but it was like a church that was set up, and their religion is Thomas Malthus or Malthusianism. I mean, this is what they're all about. And they came out with a paper that became very, very popular. In fact, it was world renowned. To the point where I've heard even in YouTube clips going back to the 1970s, even Milton Friedman was talking about it. It was called The Limits to Growth. And again, it was just basically these regurgitated ideas from Thomas Malthus himself back in the 1800s. And they actually, MIT took the ideas of the book and turned it into like a computer simulation that pretty much predicted the world would come to an end at 2020 or right around where we are today. And if you go back to Malthus, the people who know who he is, they realize that his predictions, although I think he may have some points there as far as the problem, his solutions were catastrophic. because his solutions were to proactively decrease the population or incentivize a lower birth rate. And then also not really promote, but look at the benefits of war, disease, and famine. And when I talk about the benefits, I'm talking about it's reducing the population. Therefore, the human beings on planet Earth are more, the number of human beings are more in a state of equilibrium with the amount of limited resources we have. So there is something to that, but just like Marx, they get some of the problems correct, but again, the solutions are catastrophic. And where someone that believed more in free market capitalism, like myself, would say, okay, the free market has solved these problems in the past, and we actually need more human beings. We don't need less, because if we have more human beings, especially if these human beings have a higher standard of living as a result of economic growth, which is ironically a result of higher energy use, not lower energy use, we're going to have more scientists. We're going to have more engineers. We're going to have more people that can figure out how to solve this problem, either by using the resources we have at our disposal far more efficiently, or coming up with new sources of energy, or maybe going back to the future in the form of nuclear energy, and figuring out a way to do that and make it even better, maybe more safe, more environmentally friendly as far as the waste and the disposal than it was in the past. And human beings have been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. A good friend of mine who has a podcast and a website called Sovereign Man. His name is Simon Black. He is a very good friend. And he mentioned this the other day. He's a huge student of history. And he went back and said, listen, we had this exact same problem in the Bronze Age. Because the Bronze Age, toward the end there, they were freaking out because they didn't have enough tin. And this tin, it was going to run out and the whole world was going to come to an end and yada, yada, yada. And we human beings, even back then, were able to figure out how to go from bronze to iron. And it's the same argument that you heard, whatever it was, 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago. You hear the exact same arguments today. And this is really the core premise of the World Economic Forum. And their message is really packaged in a crafty way, where their message now is all about climate change, climate change, climate change, climate change, climate change. But I would argue that if you really study what they've said in the past, this is really a Trojan horse. And I'm not here to dispute climate change. I'm not here to say that it's real, that it's fake, that I don't want to get into that at all. But what I can tell you is the Davos types, they do not care about the temperatures in the ocean. They do not care about polar bears. They do not care about icebergs. The only thing they care about is reducing the amount of energy used by humanity and lowering the birth rate. Some may argue just flat out lowering the population. And, you can throw Klaus in there. You can throw Ursula von Leyen, I think her last name, she's the head of the EU. You can throw Bill Gates in that category. And listen, I'm not here to say that if you sat down and had a beer with one of these people, they would sit there and twirl their mustache and admit that they want mass genocide and that because they just hate human beings. I'm not saying that. I'm saying their intentions are probably good, but again, their solutions with central planning are just absolutely catastrophic. I would put them in the category of Thanos. Did you see that movie by chance?
Yeah.
I forgot what it was called. It was like Endgame or something.
Endgame, yeah.
Remember his premise was basically the exact same thing. It was Malthusian. There's just too many people and there's not enough resources. So I'm going to get all these stones or whatever they were, so I can just snap my fingers and just completely eradicate half of the life or the human life in the entire universe. And then we'll be in more of a state of equilibrium. So he actually saw himself as a martyr by killing trillions of people. He was doing what no one else was willing to do, but what was necessary to continue life as we know it for those who survive. And I think, and if you listen to Milton Friedman and others like Thomas Sowell, they always point out that the most dangerous people are the people that truly believe what they're saying. And I think Friedman, if I'm not mistaken, used the example of Hitler and Mussolini. He said Hitler was far more dangerous than Mussolini because he actually bought his own BS. He actually truly believed that he was doing good, where Mussolini was just, a megalomaniac that was in search of power. Those people are dangerous, don't get me wrong, but they're nowhere near as dangerous as the people that buy their own BS, if you want to call it that. And I think that where their intentions are actually good. And I would put Gates and Klaus probably in that category. Although, listen, I can't get in their mind. I don't know what they're thinking. I know what they say. And I've read a lot of what they've written on their blogs and on the World Economic Forum website. I try to listen to their videos and be as objective as possible. And I look at the influences they have had on their lives that they explicitly admit. And I'm just kind of drawing conclusions based on probabilities. But at the end of the day, there are no certainties. So this is how we get to where we are today with this climate change message that we hear, narrative from the global elites. And listen, I think that there's different buckets. I just did a presentation at the New Orleans Investment Conference where I was doing my best to try to present this in a way that people could really get their head around. And the easiest way for me to understand it is if I compartmentalize the groups that we're dealing with that are really pushing these types of destructive narratives. And I would say first and foremost, you've got the people that want to change the world. That would be the Bill Gates, the Klaus types. And then in the middle bucket, you've got just the sociopathic politicians who don't care about anything but usurping power, control, and wealth. So I would put, the Clintons in that bucket. I would put Justin Trudeau in that bucket. I would put a lot of the politicians in the EU in that bucket. And to be very fair, I think there's a lot of Republicans that definitely deserve to be in that bucket. This is not something that's exclusive to one side of the aisle, that's for sure. And then the last bucket of the third would be just the useful idiots, which is what Stalin and Lenin referred to them as, or Milton Friedman used to call them the do-gooders. So these are the people that take the paint and throw it up against the Mona Lisa and glue themselves to the wall at some French art museum or something like that. I truly believe they have good intentions. I really do. They just don't realize that they're being played for a fool, and that climate change may be a very, very serious issue. But the people that are prompting you to do these things, they don't care about climate change. They're trying to achieve objectives that you don't know about. And they're not being forthright, and they're not going over a proper cost benefit analysis. So let's just assume for a moment that you believe that climate change is a big problem and that it could wipe out 2 billion people over, let's say, if we don't get down to net zero by 2050. That's kind of their target date. Okay, but what is going to be the cost of getting down to net zero by 2050? And how do you know that won't kill 3 billion people? You see, because if you understand how vital energy is to not just the economy, but to human life, you understand that if we transition from, let's say, fossil fuels to wind and solar too quickly, you're going to kill quite literally billions of people across the planet. And if that sounds hyperbolic, you haven't done the research. You just haven't done the research. So this is kind of how I think explains a lot of the narratives that you see in the mainstream media. The mainstream media, definitely part of the do-gooders and the useful idiots. The education system, the entertainment business, they're all just kind of following in line with these narratives that are being pushed by the global elite, Klaus, and the people at the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, great intro, George. Really helpful. And one thing that I want to mention here too is that when you talk about some of these ideas that the World Economic Forum has, these aren't things that we're just finding from the deep corners of BitChute, right? I mean, these are things that they're talking about on their YouTube channel. These are things they're talking about on their blogs, in books that people are writing who are associated with the World Economic Forum. These aren't things that are figments of our imagination. They're out there and they're saying these things directly themselves. And you really don't have to look that hard to find this sort of stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, just to give your listeners and viewers an example of how this kind of top-down narrative filters through the politicians and then through the useful idiots, going back to that movie with Thanos that I'm sure most people have seen, I saw articles in Forbes that I actually used in my presentation in New Orleans that said that Thanos is correct if you follow the science. Remember that? We got to follow the science. We got to follow the science. And isn't it interesting that today's truth is yesterday's misinformation, right? No. But yet somehow we got to follow this science that is in the science being given to us isn't following the scientific process at all. And it's just being dictated upon us by the central planners and the authoritarians. But now they're saying that eradicating half of humanity is correct if you, quote unquote, follow the science. So that's how dangerous these ideas and these narratives actually are.
No doubt. And George, so these ideas, we can talk about them and let people decide for themselves how they feel about them. But let's circle back to Klaus Schwab in particular. So we've seen in history, there have been academics before who've had zany ideas and whatnot, but is Klaus Schwab, is he just another zany academic, or does this guy have real sway on the world stage?
No, he has massive influence. Now, I don't know if this was all part of his plan going back to 1971, or it just kind of evolved and he started to take advantage and leverage the pull, or the influence, I guess is the best word, over all of these global politicians, corporate leaders. But this is where we are today. And, he always talks about the private-public partnership, which if you really listen to what he's saying, and he always talks about stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism. And you'll notice whenever you read or listen to what they say, it's always just kind of this ambiguous word salad that they can sit there and do a whole blog post, and you're left at the end just scratching your head saying, did they even say anything? Like, they don't say anything, but you've got to just read everything that they put out, or as much as you can, and then read between the lines when you combine that with the influences they've had, and then the videos they do, or the interviews they do that you can find on YouTube. That's what I find is the best way to get to the bottom of really what's going on. But when you do, you see that whether it's Mark Benioff with Salesforce, whether it's Justin Trudeau, whether it's Putin, whether it's Angela Merkel, all of these people have been significantly influenced by Klaus Schwab. And he's someone that, listen, he's like a global power broker. I mean, he's got presidents, he's got, the head of OPEC, he's got the CEO of all these massive banks. He's got them on speed dial, and he's like the liaison, I would imagine. So if Biden wants the leaders of OPEC to produce more oil, he's most likely going to try to set up that meeting and persuade them to do so through Klaus Schwab. I would say that Klaus is probably in the mix there somewhere, if I had to put money on it. So this is the type of leverage he has, and therefore he can promote these ideas through the World Economic Forum. You got to imagine for a moment here. Let's use Leonardo DiCaprio or Bono as an example. Right. Listen, these guys don't, obviously, I'm not saying anything that will shock your audience if I make a statement that they don't know anything about economics, right? They don't know anything about geopolitics. They don't know anything about energy. They don't know anything. They pretty much have never. And can you imagine Leonardo DiCaprio sitting down and learning about the Eurodollar system from, Jeff Snyder? Of course not. He's not going to do this, right? Most likely. So where do they get all of their information? And by the way, I don't know if you've known anyone from Hollywood or any actors or models, but there's a reason they're good at acting. Why? Because they're insane. That's why. I know a lot of these people, and there's a direct correlation to their proficiency in acting and their level of insanity. Meaning, the better of an actor or actress they are, the more cuckoo they are, the closer they are to a mental institution. Let me just put it to you. Let me put it to you that way. And ironically enough, these are the people that we're going to and say, hey, Brad Pitt or Leonardo DiCaprio, Bono, what's your opinion on climate change? What's your opinion on renewable energy? What's your opinion on Russia or Ukraine? Why? These are the last people that we should be paying any attention to whatsoever. But my point is they go there and they're extremely naive as to how the world works or how economics work. So the only source of information for most of these people is going to be Davos. So they go to Davos every single year. Well, these are the smartest of the smart. I mean, these are all the politicians. These are all the economists. These are all the CEOs. These are all the banksters. So if you're someone that's incredibly naive, you're going to look around you and say, yeah, I need to listen to these people. And these people are definitely right. So I'm going to kind of go along with whatever they're selling. And so I think it makes a lot of sense when you put it in those terms. That's just how we kind of operate as human beings. We just don't have time to do all the research ourselves. So we look around us to people that we trust, and we just kind of delegate our thinking to them. And giving the useful idiots the benefit of the doubt, I think that's kind of what's happened is, Klaus has all of this pull and, he's just got all this power and he knows everyone and he's so powerful. So the media, the BBC, all the entertainment people, they just look at whatever he says as though it's gospel, because it has to be, because he has all this social proof, for lack of a better word. Yeah. And I think that's really, it's really fascinating when you study it, because it's not just, okay, like a normal conspiracy theory where you're like, okay, these people are just evil and everything they do is evil and they control the world and blah, blah, blah. There's so much more to it than that. And there's so many variables that go into how we got from 1971 to where we are today. I mean, it's actually incredibly fascinating to think about. And let's be honest, on the flip side, if you're a fan of freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism, the good news is they're a giant bureaucracy, just like any other giant bureaucracy. So yeah, they may have these objectives, but it's not like they're in control of the matrix. You know what I mean? It's not like they have that much control, because at the end of the day, they're just like any other oversized, bloated government where, they're going to be just as inefficient. And we can use those inefficiencies to our advantage to push back and make sure that we get off this road to serfdom and back on a path that represents the values that this country was built on.
No doubt, George. I tell you what, one of the aha moments that I had when it comes to Klaus and the World Economic Forum and the global elite and their power, I think it would have been the first summer after the initial outbreak of COVID-19. And I noted that whether it was Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden or some of these other celebrities that you mentioned, they were using the same language.
Oh, it's a script.
It's almost like it was written like a script.
Listen, Tyler, before I retired in 2012, I had a call center, about a 40-seat call center. And that's how you did it. When we get inbound calls from advertising, you literally had a script that the telemarketers would read to make sure that you're optimizing on that inbound lead. And to your point, it's the exact same thing when you hear the Trudeaus and the Biden, they're all reading from the same script. It's like, wait a minute, they're just regurgitating. They're not only saying the same types of things as Klaus, and they're not only arguing the same position, but they're using the exact same terminology, identical. And, we see it even more so today when the UN, this gal, Rachel Greenspan, ironically enough, Greenspan is her last name, but it's spelled different than Alan Greenspan. But she comes out and argues how we need to stop raising interest rates and we just need to combat inflation with price controls.
Ooh.
And then, again, Okay, you're pinpointing the problem, but your solution is catastrophic, right? But then what happens like 3 days later? The Christina gal at the IMF, the head of the IMF, comes out and says the exact same thing. Oh, these interest rates are getting just way too high. It's going to create a global recession. So we just need targeted price controls. And then you hear Biden, you hear Trudeau, you hear Gavin Newsom say, well, how are we going to combat inflation? Oh, we just got to give people free money. We got to give them stimulus checks in order to afford the higher prices. Just completely oblivious to the fact that the problem is too much demand and not enough supply. That's why prices go up, FYI. So if you decrease supply, like a windfall profit tax, and you increase demand further through stimulus checks, how can you expect the problem not to get worse, right? So it's not just a social script. The script is economic as well. And I think that it comes down directly, potentially from Klaus or a group of these global elite. Again, they don't have control everything over the matrix, but I think they definitely try to control the narrative. And there's a lot of people that are their disciples in this cult, if you will, that get that script and just repeat it over and over and over and over again, to the point where all the useful idiots and the do-gooders think that it has to be true. Because I hear it so often, I hear it repeated so many times that it's got to be accurate. It's just like, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but it's just like you hear quantitative easing creating liquidity. Oh, it creates liquidity. It adds liquidity. You hear it so often that you never even question it. But if you actually think about it and scratch beneath the surface, that's nonsense. It doesn't enhance liquidity because you're just trading a liquid asset, i.e. a treasury, for another liquid asset, i.e. cash. It doesn't increase liquidity at all. But again, I'm just using that example as one of those things that they just try to say over and over and over and over and over again. And for the average Joe and Jane that's too busy taking their kid to soccer practice or, working on their next real estate deal, what have you, they don't have the time to research it. So they just assume that it's true.
No doubt. And one of those examples that really sticks out to me, George, is I remember somebody put together an internet mashup of a bunch of these different people all saying, we need to build back better. It was over and over and over, I think, is the summer of 2020. And that was kind of a light bulb moment to me where it felt like, hey, look, this is more than coincidence. There's some sort of global coordination going on here. And then as you fast forward a little bit more, the first draft of the $1.5 trillion stimulus bill was actually entitled the Build Back Better bill.
Yeah. So someone that's pushing back on that would say, oh, well, that was just Biden's branding, just like Trump and Make America Great, or, whatever it was, Make America Great Again, or whatever his slogan was. It's just a branding technique. Well, no, because again, to your point, you heard this from Trudeau. You heard this from politicians in Australia. And it wasn't just Build Back Better, but we've got to take COVID and use this as an opportunity. They would always say we have to use COVID as an opportunity. And it's just like, the politician in Chicago, and I'm sure many people said it before him, where you never let a crisis go to waste. And I think if you look at COVID, I think if you look at what's happening right now in Russia and Ukraine, that's exactly what they're doing. They're taking advantage of a crisis situation. And so let's go back to what I was saying their objectives are. Their two main objectives: to reduce energy use in the wealthy countries in the West, and to reduce population growth in the poorer countries. Okay, this is the Malthusian view. This is what the climate change narrative is really all about. Okay, well, let's look at that the EU have had towards Russia. Now, I'm not even going to come close to saying that their invasion of Ukraine is justified. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But what I am saying is that the policies enacted by the politicians in Europe don't hurt Russia. And maybe you could argue they hurt them just on the margin, right? But they do hurt the citizens of Europe. So when you're looking at a cost-benefit analysis, let's say sanctions as an example, or kicking Russia off the Swiss system, or freezing their dollar bank accounts. Well, this really doesn't affect Russia too much, if at all, because they've got India, they've got China, they've got all these customers that are happy to buy their energy at a discount. But so you've got a very little benefit, a very small benefit. But look at the cost involved. Look at what's happening right now in the UK. Look at what happened with their gilt market, where their entire pension fund system almost blew up. And then look at what happened with Credit Suisse, but their credit default swaps are going parabolic right now. They're higher priced, and this is insurance against them basically going bust. The prices are higher now for that insurance than it was during the GFC. Why is that? Well, I don't know for sure, but I would guess it's because their balance sheet has some type of exposure to the pension funds in the UK. Because remember, the pension funds couldn't get the return they needed. See, they need about a 7% return to meet their obligations. Well, when you drop rates down to zero for 12%, that puts those pension funds in a bind. So what do? Well, if they can only get a 1% yield, that's fine. They just lever up. They take on as much leverage as they need to get up to that 7% mark, right? Well, who are they borrowing from? I don't know. Credit Suisse, maybe, right? Deutsche Bank, I don't know. So you see what, and this is all a result of what happened with the sanctions toward Russia. If they would not have sanctioned Russia, then I would argue this wouldn't be happening at all. But I think at the very least, this would be happening to a much less degree, right? And then look at what's happening right now in Germany. They're literally having to cut down firewood so they don't freeze to death. Now think about this. These are the climate change activists, right? The leaders in the climate change initiative. They're using more coal right now than they've ever used before. And they're literally having to go out and burn firewood. There's nothing you could do as worse for the environment than to do that, right? So all of these policies have been wildly counterproductive. And then they come out with these, again, price controls where they say, oh, well, we're really going to stick it to Putin. We're just going to put a price cap on how much we're willing to pay for the natural gas and oil. Okay, you idiot. I mean, let's think that one through. That's like going to the local gas station and it's $4 a gallon for gas and you going in there and saying, you know what? I'm only willing to pay $3. That's fine, sir. Get the hell out of here. Right. Pound sand. You're a lunatic. It's and this is the exact same type of mindset that these politicians. So the next question becomes, are they stupid or are they evil? Are they really that stupid where they don't understand that these policies are going to backfire? Or do they know these policies are going to backfire and they do it anyway? Well, why would they do it anyway? Well, let's go back, Tyler, to what their main objectives are, the global elite. It's to reduce energy use in the wealthy countries like the West. So let me ask you a question. Are they going to be using more energy this winter or less energy throughout Europe?
It's looking like
that would be less, right? Yep. And then let's take it to the next step, right? If you're creating all these shortages for natural gas, well, what are you doing? You're creating a shortage of fertilizer. That's the number one ingredient is nat gas, right? So you're disrupting this type of supply chain that is very fragile to begin with. Okay, so if there's less fertilizer, then that means the price is going to go up and the fertilizer is going to go to the rich countries, meaning it's going to be taken away from the poor countries. Well, if the poor countries have less fertilizer, they have less food. If they have less food, what happens with the population? It goes down, not up. So isn't it just interesting, maybe coincidental, that all of these policies that are really doing very little to Russia are all destroying the West and creating potentially, and I hopefully this doesn't happen, but potentially mass starvation in the poor countries, which would be right in line with the Malthusian objectives of Klaus and the World Economic Forum. I'm not saying that this is what's happening. I'm not saying that this is part of their grand scheme. I am saying that these people are literally in a Malthusian cult. And I am saying that they are heavily influenced by Machiavelli. And if you read the book, The Prince, you know that they're never, ever going to let a crisis go to waste. So I'll let your viewers come to their own conclusions, but I definitely think this is a hypothesis that most people should, or that everyone should really think through.
No doubt, George. And if you do doubt the veracity of the World Economic Forum or Klaus being impacted all by Malthusian ideas, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was one of the first ever meetings of the World Economic Forum back in 1973. The founder of the Club of Rome was actually a speaker.
No, that's what I was saying. That was in 1972.
Yeah,
that was
right
in 1972.
Right on.
The founder of the Club of Rome and the guy that co-authored Limits to Growth was their keynote speaker. So and then so you say, okay, George, well, maybe that was just coincidental. And how do you know that really influenced Klaus's thinking? Because ever since then, he's been pounding the table with this message that's straight from the Club of Rome and the Limits to Growth. So, I mean, let's connect some dots here.
No doubt. Yeah, that's really helpful to understand what some of these ideas are. Let's dive into some of these ideas that are kind of economic in nature here. So you alluded earlier to stakeholder capitalism. So this move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. Can you help us understand a little bit more what that means exactly?
Yeah. So when you read Klaus, you quickly come to understand that one of the people that like his arch enemy is Milton Friedman. Whenever he gets a chance to take a dig at Milton Friedman, he does so. And now you want to talk about the script. Benioff does the exact same thing. Mark Benioff with Salesforce, who's one of these CEOs, which I would argue is just kind of like an acolyte of Klaus. Same thing. Whenever they get the chance, they always take a dig at Milton Friedman, right? So Milton Friedman was a strong proponent of shareholder capitalism, that the only purpose of an entity was to increase the benefit to shareholders, that's the only reason they exist, and they should do everything that they can to try to increase shareholder value. So Klaus came along, and he was arguing this way back in the 70s. This is nothing new for him. And so he came out and argued, no, that's a bad idea, because that's going to lead to a destruction of the planet, and it's going to lead to, no money ever going to charity. And how are we going to bring up the poor and the downtrodden, the orphans, and all these other people that need our help? How are they going to get the help they need if we're just focused on pure greed and profits and, money going exclusively to shareholders? So this is and again, if you just listen to it really quick, you're like, well, George, come on. I mean, let's not be too hard on the guy. I mean, that sounds fair enough. I mean, I want cleaner air. I want a better earth for my children. I think it's good to give to charities, and I think it's good to try to help the poor people and the downtrodden. Listen, I completely agree. But again, it's just like their climate change message. This is just simply a Trojan horse. A Trojan horse. They don't care about poor people. They don't care about climate. They don't care about polar bears. None of that stuff, like we said earlier. So why are they doing this? Okay, Tyler, this is actually a fun thought experiment. So let's just say for a moment that you're a strong proponent of this stakeholder capitalism. Well, what does that even mean? Okay, well, that means that you are distributing fewer profits to the shareholders themselves. And you are taking some of those profits and you are allocating those resources to other areas that will benefit society at large. Okay. So who is making the decision as to where those additional resources will go? Right. That would be Mark Benioff. And if Mark Benioff has more control over the profit, because let's just say only half of it is now being distributed to the shareholders, because remember, he's doing this for the greater good, Tyler, doing this for the greater good. Well, if let's say they make $10 billion in profit in 1 year, and now all of a sudden Benioff has the ability to control where 5 billion of that 10 billion is being allocated. How many politicians can you pay off with $5 billion? How much pull, how much influence can you buy with $5 billion?
Quite a bit.
See, maybe there's a local politician there that's doing something you don't like. No problem. Here's 5 million. Here's 10 million. Maybe there's this, you can basically shape and do whatever you want with all these additional resources. So what does this do? This is simply a power grab. This is a Trojan horse to usurp power, control, and wealth for these CEOs. Why would Klaus be in favor of this? Because he's the puppeteer of the CEOs. See what happens? So Klaus doesn't need them. Why does he need the money? The money is irrelevant. And to a certain degree, the power is irrelevant as long as he controls the people with the power and the money. You see, so that's all stakeholder capitalism is. And listen, just think about it rationally. It's really almost undebatable, right? The definition, when you get down to when rubber meets the road, is that the shareholders won't be able to allocate those resources the way they deem fit. And the CEOs and the Mark Benioff types are going to allocate more of the resources. This is straight corporatism. And at the end of the day, it's economic fascism. Now, I'm not talking about fascism with, discrimination against certain ethnic groups and whatnot, or fascism in the sense of nationalism. I'm talking about economic fascism, where the means of production are owned by the private sector, but the private sector is really just a puppet, or the CEOs or the board, they're just a puppet, where it's either the government, or maybe I would argue in this case, the global elite, that is really the puppeteer. It's the economic fascism at a global level. That's what stakeholder capitalism is. And let's remember that if we are going that greedy Milton Friedman route, well, what does that mean? That means that all 10 billion is going to be distributed to the shareholders. And is that bad? No, because if the shareholders care about the environment, well, they're going to donate to a worthy cause if they care about, and they can do it at a local level. So those funds are far more targeted and used far more efficiently than they would be by basically this massive bureaucracy, which is the global elite. So if you truly care about doing good, then you should be in favor of greed. You should be in favor of shareholder capitalism, and you should shun stakeholder capitalism with everything you got.
Yeah, it's interesting that these guys denigrate Milton Friedman because of somebody who puts a huge value on freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. Milton Friedman's somebody that I certainly look up to. And for all the listeners, if you haven't watched the Free to Choose series, I'd encourage everybody to do that. It's absolutely terrific. While I still have you here, George, we're running a little bit short on time, but I do want to just get your perspective on the market right now, kind of what you're seeing. So from a high level, what's your take on the markets right now? What are you watching closely? Is there anything out there, cracks in the system that you're seeing that give you concern? What's your perspective there?
Yes, I think, in fact, it's good timing here, or I don't know if good is the right word, but there are a lot of significant events that are playing out right now, like within the last couple of days here. And so what am I talking about? I'm talking about, number one, not just the inversion of the yield curve at the 2-year and 10-year, but the inversion of the yield curve at the 3-month and the 10-year. So let's go back here a little bit so your viewers, we're all on the same page. When the 2-year and 10-year inverts, meaning that there's a higher interest rate on a 2-year treasury than there is on a 10-year treasury, that means that we will have a recession, potentially a global recession, within 18 to 24 months, with like 95% probability, going all the way back to 1950. So this is one of the best, most powerful, accurate indicators there is in global macro. But it doesn't give you too much of a sense of the timing. It says, okay, 18 to 24 months, that doesn't help me that much. But what does give you a better sense of the timing is the 3-month and the 10-year. When the 3-month inverts with the 10-year, the bond market, which is usually the smart money, is telling you, okay, Fed's going to pivot. And if the Fed's going to pivot, what would prompt them to do that? Especially after they've been talking so hawkishly. Well, that would be something very negative for the global economy, or maybe just the domestic economy. That would mean an asset crash. That would mean some sort of black swan type of event. Now, let me be very clear. Today is Wednesday, I think Wednesday the 19th, just looking at my computer here. So I want to give people the exact dates. As of yesterday evening, that would be Tuesday the 18th, the 3-month and the 10-year got within 3 or 4 basis points of inverting. So we didn't invert yet, but we're getting very, very close. And for your viewers, I don't care if they're real estate investors or what type of category you'd put them in, but I would strongly suggest them paying attention to the interest rate on the 3-month and the 10-year and realize that when the 3-month gets above, let's just say 5-10 basis points above the 10-year and stays there for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, this increases the probability massively that we are going into another type of crisis situation. Now, is it a global financial crisis? I rarely do you have the same, does lightning strike in the same spot twice, right? But it does mean that we have the same types of cracks showing up in the dam right now. And although it might not look exactly like 2008, the system is telling us that there's just as big of a problem that's brewing right now. Now, let me combine that with something that is also very, very important and extremely esoteric. So unless your audience is watching my YouTube channel, they probably won't know this. So this is going to be great insider information. There's something called a swap line, Tyler, a dollar swap line. So this is basically between central banks. And right now, the Swiss central bank has a swap line opened up with the Federal Reserve. So basically, this is where the Swiss central bank can come in and say, hey, listen, there are some banks within our repo system or within our marketplace that need dollars. And we don't really have the dollars. So why don't we give you Swiss francs, Fed? You can give us dollars. It's just an entry on our balance sheet, no big deal. And then in 2 weeks or a week, whatever we agree on, we'll go ahead and swap back. And because you're doing us a favor, when we swap back, when we give you the dollars back, we'll give you a little bit of an interest rate. Basically like almost like a repo transaction between central banks. And then what happens is the Swiss central bank will hold an auction, and they do this every Wednesday, where they say, hey, banks, we've got dollars. If you need them, go ahead and place your bid, and we'll give you those dollars that you need. So what's unbelievable, really shocking, is usually you get no bids. It's just a big goose egg. And people can see this if they go to the Swiss National Bank's website, is goose egg, goose egg, goose egg. Now, what happened a couple of weeks ago is that shot up to $3 billion, which is a drop in the bucket, but that's not the point. The point is it's the concept that these global international banks that, by the way, can create as many dollars as they want. Let's not forget, there is nothing constraining them as far as them being able to create their own dollars. They're in the euro dollar system, which is reserveless, meaning they don't need bank reserves at the Fed, and cashless. They don't need green pieces of paper to create dollar-denominated loans, right? Now, what does constrain them is counterparty risk. They're not going to create a dollar loan to, let's say, Credit Suisse if they don't think Credit Suisse is going to be in business in 6 months. Now, they have the capacity to, but they're not going to do that. So what it tells us when they start using these swap lines is there's an increased amount of counterparty risk in the global banking system. Why? Because these banks can't get the dollars they need that other banks could create easily if they were confident in their balance sheet. And to test this hypothesis, what you would have to do is you'd have to go back to other times of severe strain with the banking system. So go back to COVID, March of 2020. What happened? The dollar swap lines at the Swiss National Bank went through the roof, and they were consistent. It went from 0, 0, 0, 0 to every single week, every single Wednesday, banks showing up that auction and bidding for dollars. Okay, let's go back to the GFC. What happened? This started in December of 2007, and happened every single week throughout the entirety of 2008. So prior to Lehman Brothers, prior to Bear Stearns, This was the canary in the coal mine, right? So we go back 2 weeks, that was 3 billion with, I believe, 5 counterparties. If I'm not 5, maybe it was 9 counterparties. Last Wednesday, it goes up to 6 billion with 11 counterparties. The data came out just this morning. It went up to 11 billion with 17 counterparties.
Wow.
This is massive. This is massive. And again, there are no certainties. There are only probabilities. But if we, I'm definitely going to watch it on my channel. I'd suggest you guys doing the same thing and notifying your audience. But if we continue to see these swap lines utilized with the Swiss central bank, and if we continue, even if the dollar amount doesn't go up to a significant degree, this is the proverbial canary in the coal mine. This is the red flag. This is the marketplace screaming at us that we could be on the precipice of another global crisis. So definitely something that I would suggest your listeners and viewers pay attention to.
George, that's super interesting. And I wish we had another hour here so we could continue to dive into some of these topics, man. I really, really appreciate your time today. Learned a ton from this conversation. If people want to follow you and what you've got going on at Rebel Capitalist, what's the best way to do that?
Oh, they can just Google Rebel Capital or go to YouTube and you can just type in Rebel Capitalist or George Gammon. And both my channels, the George Gammon channels where I do the whiteboard videos, and the Rebel Capitalist channels when I kind of just riff on these economic topics like the ones that we've been discussing in this interview.
Excellent. George, again, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me.